Hello everyone, we're going to take a little bit of a break today from ploughing through volume 2 of Great Expectations, and we're going to start to have a think about how to write a comparative essay. This is the ultimate goal at the end of your course, is to compare Great Expectations with The Great Gatsby, and I understand that it's something you might feel nervous about. It might be something that you feel raring to go with, that you've been itching to do for a while, and I've been holding you back, making you write about one text at a time. And that has been my aim, really, is to make you really confident in each of the individual texts so that comparing is as easy as possible. Now, in my opinion, comparing texts is one of the most difficult things to do. In your GCSE course, comparing the poems, in my mind, was the hardest essay. And I think this is the hardest part of our English A-level. Don't tell Miss Black. So I'm going to take you through today what is an introduction to comparing. So if you don't understand everything, or if you have questions, or if you have a go and it doesn't really work, don't worry. This is the start of a longer conversation. So what I say today might not work, and we might rejig it and try again, but it's a start. So let's have a look at what you're aiming for. So this is what a question would look like on the exam paper. Evaluate the effectiveness of the methods used by the writers of your two studied texts to present individuals as outsiders from society. In your response, you must consider the use of linguistic and literary features, connections across texts, and relevant contextual factors. 30 marks. Now, I've lifted this straight from an exam paper, so it's a copy and paste, so the wording is exact. Now, the first part of the question, up until the word present, will always be the same. So you will always be evaluating the effectiveness of the methods. Now, what does that mean? When we talk about evaluating the effectiveness, we're not necessarily asking you to judge how good a writer you think Fitzgerald is and how good a writer you think Dickens is, but to what extent do you think they've achieved their purpose? So when we talk about effects, we're talking about the writer's purposes or supposed purposes in writing their texts. When we're looking at the methods, we're looking at the decisions and choices these writers have made in all walks of life in their book, not just the language they've used or the characters, but the settings and the way it's told, and the way they've produced it and released it, and all sorts of choices. Anything that could have been different is a method, is a choice. You're always going to be writing about the two studied texts together, never alone. So all the essays you've written so far, you'll never do something like that in the exam. And it will always be to present a particular theme. Now that theme will always be related to our topic of society and the individual. This specific question is individuals who are outsiders from society. Now the line underneath, in your response you must consider the use of linguistic and literary features, is what we've been practicing. That's your analysis, looking at word level choices and sort of literary themes, motifs, patterns, things like that. The connections across texts is the comparing element. It's known as assessment objective 4, which is the final thing that I haven't taught you yet, which is to compare the texts and to include and compare their contextual factors. So were these writers writing in the same era or different ones, under same conditions or different conditions, and how were they responded to? Now, we haven't done a lot yet on the responses to both texts. That comes later on in the course, but that's something that you'll consider when you compare them as well, is how were they received, both at the time and now in modern culture, how are they seen and viewed by readers. So let's have a look at two examples from Great Expectations and The Great Gatsby and start to think about how we compare them. So let's read one from Great Expectations first. To let, glared at me from empty rooms. A frowsy morning of soot and smoke attired this forlorn creation of Barnard, and it had strewed its ashes on its head and was undergoing penance. So that's from chapter 21 of Great Expectations. And let's compare it with this setting from The Great Gatsby. This is a valley of ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with a transcendent effort, of ash-grey men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. So there's lots of things that we might look to compare here straight away. We might look at the vocabulary and the sort of lexical sets we've got to do with ash and soot and greyness. They immediately stand out as being similar. We might have a look at the perspective from which these are being told. To let glared at me. We're in this first person retrospective in the past tense, whereas on the right hand side in The Great Gatsby we're in the present tense. This is a valley of ashes. We're there right now looking at the scene with our narrator. So there's a difference there in the method being used to present these two settings. So we can spend time with short extracts like this. We can also compare whole structural features across the whole of both texts. For example, the serialized form of Great Expectations compared with the heavily edited and sort of one final version of The Great Gatsby, which came out as a whole novella. There's all sorts of elements that we can compare. And in doing so, you might start to create a planning grid or a table that looks something like this. Now, there's a lot of detail on this next slide, and we're not going to read the whole thing, but just to give you an idea of the depth of planning that you might go into, let's have a look at this together. So at the top there, we've got Dickens, the Dickens extract, and again, we can pick some simple features straight away. The year, 1860, compared with Fitzgerald in 1925. We've got the extract there and some features. So we have on the left-hand side the repetition of to let. We have that this is being written in the past tense and Pip is passive. We've got other features in there like personification. We've also got the religious imagery of penance. This was a Christian novel with Christian readers. And in the same time in the Great Gatsby row at the bottom, we're in the present tense, not the past tense. We've got metaphor instead of personification. We've got triadic structures, listing, and we've got the use of colour. We could think about both of these societies. Dickens's Christian society, Fitzgerald's sort of American society, which is sort of got a number of social classes and it's based on wealth and prosperity. Similar to Great Expectations, we've got our different classes that are based heavily on wealth and prosperity. So there's similarities in the contexts of both these societies in terms of their class systems and striving and reaching to be better than you are already and to move up your station. But the methods that these writers are using are subtly different, but there are similarities as well. Okay, so you might put together some sort of plan like this before you wrote a comparative piece of writing, and you can come back to this slide in your own time and look at it in more detail if you wish. So when you compare, you're very simply observing similarities and differences. It's like playing spot the difference. What's similar or the same and what's not? So your essays will compare the similarities and differences between two things: the methods the writers are using and the effects that they achieve, which link to their purposes. Okay, so that leaves you with a bit of a matrix possibility. So let me show you what the possibilities are. There's 4. It could be that both Fitzgerald and Dickens use the same methods and achieve the same effects. So the same methods and the same effects. So they achieve the same purpose. Okay, same. It might be that the two writers use the same methods, so they both use metaphor or they both use patterns and clues, but for different effects. They have a different purpose. Okay, so they might now be using the same method, but with some different effects. However, it can be different still. The writers might be using different methods. So Fitzgerald, heavily fragmented, heavily edited, every word counts. Dickens, writing serially, churning out the pages each week to get his novel out for the next instalment. But they might achieve the same effects. They might achieve the same purpose, but they just got there in a different way. So that's where we have different methods, but the same effect. There's more than one way to reach the same effect. And then the fourth possibility, right at the very bottom corner there, is that actually in these two texts, these two writers might be doing different things to achieve different purposes, but they're both commenting on society and the individual. That's something that will always link the two together, is that their texts are based around these themes. So it may be that Fitzgerald is doing one thing to achieve one outcome, and Dickens is doing a different thing to achieve a different outcome. Okay, so we've got four possibilities when we're writing about these texts to sort of really notice. Now, this is what the exam board sort of says. You need to explore connections across texts, informed by your linguistic and literary concepts and methods. Okay, now what does that mean? Component 2, which is what you're doing, requires students to explore and evaluate the ways different writers convey similar themes and issues. So, different writers, similar issues, in different texts, making connections between the texts, as well as looking at the significance of the context of production and reception. What does that mean, the context of production and reception? Well, what that means is the way in which a text is made is its context of production. So simply for Great Expectations, the context of production was the serialized form, written weekly, taking feedback from people as he went, not necessarily knowing the end of the story as he was writing, which is different from the context of Fitzgerald's production, which was heavily fragmented, sharing draft copies with other writers, getting their opinion before the final one was released all in one go. The context of production might also be the societal influences. Dickens was influenced by his own childhood and his own experiences and the world around him. So was Fitzgerald. He was influenced by 1920s post-war society and the realities of what we now call the Jazz Age. And then you've got the other side of the text. After the text has been produced, it's received. People receive the text, critics, readers, and that's the context of reception. So Great Expectations was quite well received. It did really well. It sold lots of copies. Dickens was sort of back on the pedestal as a great writer. Fitzgerald's text, on the other hand, was not well received. It got quite poor reviews. People didn't really know what to make of it. They didn't think it was as good as his other works. But over time, the reception of that book has grown in popularity and increased. So that's something that you might not know too much about at the moment, but it is something that you eventually will come to compare when you write about these two texts. Now, texts can be connected in a variety of ways. It's not just the language or the themes. Here are the ways they can be connected. The language and style that the writers use. The narrative structure that they use. They both use a frame narrative with dual narrators. The characterization and relationships that we see in these texts. The main themes and the concerns that they have could be similar or different. The context in which they were writing, and the contemporary reception, the way we view them now in 2020 and 2021 next year when you'll be writing about them. These are all connections between these texts, and you are comparing all of them. So you have a broad range of things to choose from. You're not just limited to looking at the words in front of you on the page. Now, what words should we use to compare? Now, I could give you all sorts of lists of comparative words and you could chuck them into your essays, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're comparing well. But if you are comparing well, I should expect to see some of these things happening. So here's a list of words that you might see in a comparative essay. So just take some time to have a look through them. Okay, so they should be similar words to what you used in your poetry comparison back at GCSE. And some of them are for similarity and some of them are for difference. But they allow you to handle both texts at the same time. And that's really what you're trying to do in a comparative essay, is to hold two things up side by side and look at one and look at the other and say what's similar and what's different about them. Now, how do you write the introduction? This is a question that I've been asked many times. It's hard enough to write an introduction about one text, but doing it about two, well, it gets a little bit harder. So what I'm going to do is share with you an introduction that I wrote sort of off the cuff in an email the other day. And then I'm going to break it down for you, how it links to what you already do with your general, specific and thesis. But now we have to do it with both texts at the same time. So let's read it together and then I'll break it down. Both Dickens, in his serialized retrospective 19th century novel tracing the Bildungsroman of a blacksmith, and Fitzgerald, in his fragmented modernist snapshot of 1920s America, present settings which symbolize specific stances towards society. Most prominent in Dickens's work are the settings of Smithfield, Market, and Barnard's Inn upon Pip's arrival to London in Volume 2, and in Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, The Valley of Ashes, which sits between the corruption of New York City and the glamour of Long Island's great eggs, is an integral location which depicts social decay. Ultimately, we may question why these writers both depict such monstrous settings in such detail. To me, the focus of both writers was perhaps to comment on the deprivation and squalor which was the reality behind the empty promises of great expectations and green lights in their respective cultures. Now, that introduction you might think is rubbish. It might intimidate you. You might think, how could I ever write something like that? But actually, there's three clear sections. There's a general, a specific, and a thesis. And in each one, there's probably only one sentence. It's just about knowing what to put in each sentence. So let's break them down and look at them one by one. So, the general. The thing we're doing here is we're coming up with a general idea that both texts share in some sense. They might not be exactly the same, but it's a link between the two. So my general area, which would link to my essay question, my essay topic, is that both writers present settings which symbolize specific stances towards society. So they're both creating the same effect. They're both writing for the same purpose. But the methods they use to get there are going to be subtly different, and that's what I'm going to compare throughout my essay, is how do their methods to show their settings differ. So I always start with the word both, because then immediately you're comparing. You're showing your examiner and your reader that, look, I'm talking about two texts here. So both Dickens, then I've got my positive in his serialized retrospective 19th century novel, blah, 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 and Fitzgerald, a positive again in his blah, blah, blah novel, and here's what they both do. So that's my opening statement, my general statement, before I go on to the specific, which is here. Most prominent in Dickens is this specific example, Smithfield Market and Barnard's Inn. So here's an example. And in The Great Gatsby, it's the Valley of Ashes. Here's my example. Somewhere in my essay, I'm going to be comparing these two settings and look at the different methods used in these settings to show what these writers think about society. And ultimately, what I've said by the end of this specific statement is that they both depict social decay. So their effect is their specific stance towards society is that there is decay, that there is rot in the middle of society, and these settings help to show and symbolize that. And once I've vaguely listed the sort of settings that I'm going to focus on, then I can come up with my thesis. And I'll start with a question. What question do these texts raise? We may question why these writers are doing this. Why are they depicting these settings in so much detail? And then I come up with my thesis to try to answer that question that I've thought of. And I use my tentative language. It's perhaps, possibly, maybe, to comment on the deprivation and squalor, which is the truth, the reality behind these promises of great expectations, the American dream, and green lights. So these writers are peeling back the veneer, peering behind the window to see what's it really like. Okay, not what we see sort of on the surface, not what we promise, but what's the truth, what's the reality, and that's part of what the conversation of literature is about, is finding the truth. Okay, so I've done the same thing I'd do if I were writing about one text, but I'm now talking about two texts. Okay, so what's the guidance to do your own introduction for any given essay? Well, here are some things that you should really focus on. In your general statement, use both to make sure you're comparing straight away. Include the positives and try to make them relevant to the topic at hand. Don't just throw in anything that you know, but maybe there's a quotation or a piece of context or some information which links to the topic. So they could be quotation-based or context-based in your positive. You can really sort of show off what you know if you could slip in a little quotation in there without analysing it, just to refer to a character by some sort of other name. Then give your specific examples from both texts. Now these help explore the topic in the question, and in doing this you're making a connection between anything. It could be the setting, the genre, the characters, a theme, context, or the features. You can specifically name something there that you're going to explore in more detail. And then in your thesis, find that common question that both these texts raise related to the topic that you've been given. It'll be something to do with society and an individual. What's the common question? And then what's your thesis now that you're going to offer at the start of your essay? What are you going to try to explore? Okay, what are the writers giving the same answer to this question? Have they got the same purpose or not? And are the writers going about it in the same way? Are they using the same methods or not? And this is your thesis now. This might change by the time you get to your conclusion. It might change throughout the essay, but we're planning what we want to explore, not necessarily what the answer is. A good essay begins with a question. So, you're going to have a go. And you're going to have half term to do this as well, so you'll have 2 weeks to really sort of get into this. And I can give you some options. So here they are. One way to do this is to choose the introduction from one of your recent Great Expectations essays, and you're going to build upon it by adding in a comparison with Great Gatsby. So you've recently written essays about wealth and status, mysterious individuals, settings, all sorts of different things. You can now build upon what you've got as a starting point and add in the Great Gatsby as a point of comparison. Okay, so once you've done that, to write an introduction, you're then going to take one of the paragraphs from that same essay that you wrote about Great Expectations, and you're going to build upon it by then adding in comparison with the Great Gatsby. Now, be careful not to make this mistake. Comparison isn't writing one whole paragraph about Great Expectations and then one whole other paragraph about the Great Gatsby. It's about integrating the two together. So you should have one overarching question to your paragraph, and you go between both texts, back and forth, to find some sort of answer. Don't just write all about one and then all about the other. Okay. However, if you're finding that hard to build upon a previous essay that was only about one text, we can do this. You could write an introduction and one paragraph to a new essay, the one that I showed you at the start of this video. Evaluate the effectiveness of the methods used by the writers of your two studied texts to present individuals as outsiders from society. And you can then sit and think with a blank page, who are the outsiders in society in Great Expectations? Who are the outsiders from society in The Great Gatsby? What are both writers saying about these outsiders? What's their role? What happens to them? Do they become insiders? Do they stay as outsiders? Do they live? Do they die? Do they succeed? Do they fail? What methods do these writers use to show those outsiders? One introduction paragraph and one opening paragraph, so 2 paragraphs in total. Here are some titles that you worked on in the past, and you should choose one. So just one. I'm not asking you to write all these essays. I'm only asking you to do the introduction on one paragraph. Evaluate the effectiveness of the methods used by the writers of your two studied texts to present how individuals differ in public and private settings, the behaviour of individuals towards others based on their wealth and status, individuals who experience embarrassment or shame, mysterious individuals in society, and individuals who are limited by the restraints of others. These are all areas that you've explored before. In your response, you must consider the use of linguistic and literary features, the connections across the texts, and the relevant contextual factors. So in each of those essays, there's a particular theme. So how individuals differ in public and private settings, the importance of wealth and status, embarrassment and shame, mysterious individuals, and how individuals who are limited by restraints of others. Sorry for that wonky line. So each one has a particular focus. What is Dickens's purpose and what's Fitzgerald's purpose in each of those topic areas? What methods do they use to get there? Now, so many of the methods are always the same, and there is a range of methods that both Dickens and Fitzgerald have in common that will always be there, to do with their patterning, their structure, their dual narrators. They're always the same. But for each of these themes, there will be specific passages, specific set pieces in the texts that are different, that you can compare and that you can really get into detail with. So it's about finding the balance between zooming in and looking at specific words and sentences and passages, but also remembering to come back to the big picture. These are whole texts. What are they about? What are these writers trying to say? What are they adding to the conversation about society and individuals? Okay, so a tough piece of writing, but something that I think you're ready to have a go at, and I don't want you to feel worried or concerned if you can't do it yet. We still have a whole year to go on the course. We've got plenty of time, and we still need to finish Great Expectations and revisit Great Gatsby. So there's lots of time to practice and get things wrong and get things right. Okay, so please do communicate with me by email. Please do let me know what you're finding easy and what you're finding hard. Send me work to look at. Those of you who have been sending me work, you'll know that I get back to you, I give you feedback, and it keeps you ticking over. So please do share, don't be strangers. I hope you enjoy doing this piece of work. So I'd like it back if possible on that first Monday after half term, which I think is the 1st of June. I think it's that magic date that the government have set for primary schools. So 1st of June, hopefully I'm correct, send me your introduction and first paragraph comparing both texts in one of these essay titles. Okay, so enjoy, good luck, and I'll see you all soon. Thank you very much.